The Duke of Thornfield did not look at her, not once. Not when she descended from the carriage, her grey travelling cloak dusty from the long roads of Northumbria, nor when she crossed the great stone threshold of Thornwick Park, the ancestral home that was now, by law and contract, hers. He stood before the hearth in the cavernous entry hall, one hand braced against the cold marble of the mantelpiece, his gaze fixed upon the sputtering flames, as if they held a more compelling drama than the arrival of his wife. Philippa Caldwell, now the Duchess of Thornfield, had known this would not be a marriage of affection. It was a transaction, elegantly papered over with social necessity. Her father, a merchant of considerable, though recently diminished, fortune, had secured his only daughter a title. The Duke, in turn, had secured the funds to keep the lead on his roof and the bailiffs from his door. It was a bargain of mutual desperation, and the Duke's silence was the clearest possible statement of his resentment. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Finch, whose face was a study in starched resignation, curtsied low.
"Your Grace,"
she murmured, her eyes flicking nervously from the rigid column of the Duke's back to Philippa's pale, composed face.
"Welcome to Thornwick." "Thank you, Mrs. Finch,"
Philippa said, her voice quiet but clear in the echoing space. She began to unfasten the clasp of her cloak.
"Allow me, Your Grace."
A young maid, her cheeks pink with awe and fear, hurried forward. As the cloak was lifted from her shoulders, Philippa felt a dozen pairs of eyes upon her. The footmen standing like statues by the doors, the maids hovering in the shadows of the grand staircase, all of them witnesses to her silent reception. She stood in her simple wool dress, the dark blue a stark contrast to the faded grandeur of the hall. The portraits of generations of Sinclairs, Alastair's ancestors, stared down from the walls, their painted expressions ranging from haughty disdain to bored indifference. She felt she was the latest acquisition, and an unwelcome one at that. Finally, the Duke spoke, his voice a low baritone that seemed to absorb the light from the room. "Mrs. Finch, you will show the Duchess to her rooms." He did not turn. He did not say her name.
"Of course, Your Grace."
The housekeeper's relief was palpable.
"If you would follow me, Your Grace."
Philippa gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She had expected coldness, but the deliberate, public nature of the insult was a new weight in her chest. It was a performance for the benefit of his staff, a declaration that she was a presence to be tolerated, not a person to be welcomed. She ascended the wide, sweeping staircase, her hand trailing on the polished oak banister, worn smooth by centuries of hands that had belonged here. Her own felt alien upon it. They passed through the main gallery of the family wing, its doors of rich, dark wood closed and silent. They passed the Duchess's traditional suite, its double doors slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of silk wall coverings and the curve of a gilded chaise longue. Mrs. Finch did not slow. She led Philippa past it, down a narrower, colder corridor, and then up a tight spiral of stone steps that Philippa had not even noticed, tucked away behind a tapestry depicting a grim hunting scene. The air grew colder with every step. The scent of beeswax and lemon oil gave way to a damp, mineral smell of old stone and disuse. At the top of the stairs was a single, heavy oak door.
"The North Tower, Your Grace,"
Mrs. Finch said, her voice tight with an apology she was not permitted to utter. She turned a large iron key in the lock, and the door swung inward with a protesting groan. The room was large and circular, with 3 tall, narrow windows that looked out over the bleakest part of the park, a stretch of windswept moorland that met a perpetually grey sky. The air inside was glacial, holding a deep, settled chill that no fire could fully banish. The furniture was sparse and severe, A heavy, dark bedstead, a single wardrobe, a plain washstand, and a small writing desk. There was no comfortable chair, no rug on the wide, dark floorboards, no sign of recent life. "It has not been inhabited," Mrs. Finch admitted, her gaze fixed on a point just past Philippa's shoulder. "Since the death of the old Duke's spinster sister, some 40 years prior." So, this was it. Not just a separate room, but a separate existence. A room for a forgotten woman, an unwanted appendage to the family line. It was a statement of exile, delivered within the very walls of her new home. Philippa walked to the center of the room and placed her small traveling case on the floor. She did not weep. She had done her crying in the weeks before the wedding, mourning the quiet, scholarly life she had imagined for herself. Now was not the time for tears. Now was the time for endurance. "It will suffice," Philippa said, her voice betraying nothing. She turned to the housekeeper. "You may have my trunks brought up. And please, ask a maid to lay a fire. The chimney appears to be sound." Mrs. Finch looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. In the Duchess's calm, level gaze, she saw not the outrage or the hysterics she might have expected, but something that looked unnervingly like resolve. "At once, Your Grace," she said, and with another curtsy she retreated, closing the heavy door and leaving Philippa alone in the cold heart of her new life. Philippa stood in the silence, listening to the housekeeper's footsteps fade down the stone stairs. She walked to one of the tall, arched windows. The glass was grimy, distorting the view of the moors beyond. She could see a section of the formal gardens below, already succumbing to the neglect of autumn, and beyond that, the stone wall that enclosed the estate. She was a prisoner here, as surely as if the iron key had been turned from the outside. But her father, in his last letter to her, had written, "You have a finer mind than any man I know, Philippa. A title is a cage, perhaps, but some cages have keys hidden within their own walls. Find your key." He had known her, had seen the practical, methodical intelligence that society had no use for in a woman. He had taught her accounts, had let her study the estate maps of their own modest property, had praised her notes on crop rotation and soil management. He had given her tools, even if the world would not give her a workshop. She looked around the cold, barren room. A cage, yes, but a large one. And it was hers. She ran a gloved finger along the dusty sill of the window. There was work to be done. First, a fire. Then, she would begin her search for the key. The Duke of Thornfield had given her the coldest, most forgotten room in his house. He believed he was shunting her into obscurity. He could not have known that he had just given her a laboratory. The first night in the North Tower was a battle against the cold. A young maid named Agnes, with wide, sympathetic eyes, had managed to coax a sullen fire from the long dormant hearth, but its warmth was a small, flickering island in an ocean of chill. The dampness of the stone walls seemed to drink the heat before it could reach the corners of the room. Philippa ate the solitary dinner that was brought to her on a tray, a slice of cold meat, a piece of bread, a joyless apple, and did not complain. To complain was to admit the insult had landed. After Agnes had cleared the tray and curtsied her way out, Philippa was left to the sounds of the old tower, the wind whistling through the ill-fitting window frames, the scuttling of some small creature behind the wainscoting, the mournful hoot of an owl from the moors. She did not undress for bed. Instead, she wrapped her travelling cloak tightly around her shoulders and sat at the small, rickety writing desk. By the light of a single candle, she opened the small, leather-bound ledger she had brought with her, a gift from her father. It was empty, its pages clean and waiting. On the first page, she wrote the date. Then she wrote assets. Underneath, she made a single entry. 1 room, north-facing. Contents: 1 bed, 1 wardrobe, 1 desk, 1 washstand. Condition: poor. She paused, the nib of her pen hovering over the paper. Then she wrote a second heading: liabilities. Under this, she listed them: a husband's contempt, an estate's indifference, the social isolation of a parvenu, and finally the most pressing, a profound and penetrating cold. She stared at the words. It was a bleak accounting. She could feel the grief she had so carefully suppressed begin to rise, a cold tide that threatened to overwhelm her. She thought of her father's library, warm and smelling of leather and pipe smoke, the one place she had always felt completely herself. She thought of the future she had lost, a future of quiet study and familiar comforts. A single, hot tear escaped and fell onto the page, smudging the ink of the word cold. She watched it blur, then took a slow, deliberate breath. This was a pointless indulgence. Pity was a luxury she could not afford. She closed the ledger with a soft snap. Endurance was a form of action, but it was not the only form. Her father had taught her that. He had faced financial ruin not with despair, but with calculation, selling what he must to save what he could, including, she now understood, his daughter. He had seen it as a strategic retreat, not a surrender. She would honor that pragmatism. She would treat her new life as a problem to be solved, an unbalanced sheet to be reconciled. She rose from the desk and began to inspect her cage more thoroughly. The room was circular, as she had noted, but on one side, almost hidden in the shadows, was another door, smaller and plainer than the one to the stairs. She had assumed it was a closet. Taking her candle, she approached it. There was no keyhole. A simple iron latch held it shut. It was stiff with rust and disuse, but with the pressure of both her thumbs, it gave way with a sharp crack that echoed in the silence. The door opened into not a closet, but another, smaller room. It was a derelict study, or perhaps a scriptorium from a much older incarnation of the house. A thick blanket of dust covered everything. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling in great funereal swags. In the center of the room stood a heavy oak table, its surface scarred with old ink stains. Along the curved wall was a set of built-in bookshelves, sagging but still intact. And on those shelves, miraculously, were books. Not the fine, leather-bound volumes of the main library, but a collection of practical, workaday tomes. They were ledgers, mostly, their spines faded and their covers warped by damp. She pulled one down. The title, barely legible in gold leaf, read Thornwick Estate Accounts, 1750 to 1760. She pulled down another. Tenant Rolls, East Riding, 1770. A third, A Treatise on Northern Husbandry. It was a forgotten archive. The administrative heart of the estate, abandoned decades ago when a more modern office was likely established elsewhere. Here, in this dusty, forgotten chamber, was the story of Thornwick Park, its income and its expenditures, its triumphs and its failures, written in the spidery copperplate of long-dead stewards. A slow, fierce joy, the first she had felt in months, ignited within her. This was more than a key. It was a map. It was a blueprint. The Duke had exiled her to the periphery, but in his ignorance, he had given her the estate's discarded memory. She spent the next hour exploring the small room. Behind the table, she found a stack of old survey maps of the estate, rolled and tied with brittle ribbon. She found books on forestry, on water management, on animal husbandry. It was the library of a man who had worked the land, not merely owned it. This must have been the domain of the old Duke's sister, the spinster. A woman who, perhaps like herself, had found her purpose in the practical and the overlooked. Returning to the main chamber, she saw it differently. It was not just a cold bedroom. It was an antechamber. It was a base of operations. The cold was still a liability, but the discovery of the study was an asset of incalculable value. She went back to her ledger, and beneath her first entry, she added a new one, under assets. One private study, fully furnished with the economic history of the estate. That night, she slept. It was not a deep or restful sleep, but it was not the sleep of the defeated. She dreamt of columns of figures, of acres of land, of the slow, steady work of putting a broken thing back together. The next morning, she rose before dawn. She did not ring for Agnes. She coaxed the embers of the fire back to life herself, adding the few pieces of wood left in the basket. The cold was sharp and biting, but it felt less like a personal affront and more like a simple fact of her environment, something to be managed. She had a plan. It was a small plan, but it was a beginning. She would clean the study. She would organize the books. She would begin to read. She would understand Thornwick Park better than the man who owned it. He had made her invisible, but she would use that invisibility. In the cold silence of the North Tower, she would learn every secret the estate had to tell. And knowledge, her father had always said, was a form of power that no one could take from you. In the weeks that followed, Philippa's life settled into a quiet, disciplined routine. She took her meals in her room, a silent, solitary ritual that she came to prefer. It saved her from the strain of the grand, empty dining room and the possibility of an encounter with her husband. She saw him only on Sundays, at the obligatory church service in the village of Little Thornton, where he would stand stiffly beside her in the family pew, the width of a prayer book between them, a gulf as wide as an ocean. He never spoke to her. He never met her eye. The county noticed. Whispers followed them like the rustle of dry leaves. A merchant's daughter. No breeding. The Duke looks so grim. Philippa heard them, and she catalogued them as she catalogued everything else. Data points confirming her isolation. Her real life began and ended in the North Tower. With the help of Agnes, who had quickly become a silent, devoted co-conspirator, she undertook the reclamation of the small study. They spent 2 days cleaning it. They swept away the shrouds of dust and cobwebs, scrubbed the floorboards, and washed the single window until the weak northern light could properly enter. Agnes, her face smudged with dirt but her eyes bright with purpose, seemed to find a satisfaction in the work that mirrored Philippa's own. She was a witness to the Duchess's strange, solitary project, and her loyalty was given not to the title, but to the woman.
My mother was in service at Aldgate Priory, Your Grace.
Agnes confided one afternoon, as they were carefully wiping the grime from the spines of the old ledgers.
The mistress there, Lady Annabel, she had a mind for numbers, kept the books herself. The master called it her little hobby. She paused, then added, but when he died, it turned out her little hobby was the only thing that kept the roof over their heads.
Philippa looked at the girl.
Your mother was a wise woman, Agnes. She said a house has 2 hearts, Agnes replied, her voice low. The one everyone sees in the drawing room, and the one that beats in the steward's office. She said you have to know which one is really keeping the place alive.
Philippa placed a newly cleaned ledger on the shelf, a treatise on drainage and soil improvement.
I believe she was right.
Once the room was clean, it became her sanctuary and her workshop. Each morning she would rise, dress in one of her plainest gowns, and begin her work. She started with the most recent ledgers she could find, from about a decade ago, and began the laborious task of cross-referencing them with the older volumes. A story began to emerge, a story of slow, creeping decline. Thornwick Park was bleeding money, not in a dramatic torrent, but in 1,000 small, unstaunched wounds. Rents were collected erratically. Tenants were falling behind, their pleas for repairs to roofs and fences going unanswered. The estate manager, a man named Fletcher, was paying inflated prices for seed and equipment from a supplier who, Philippa discovered after cross-referencing with a local gazetteer, was his brother-in-law. The timber from the West Woods, a valuable asset, was being sold for a fraction of its worth. It was a classic case of mismanagement, born of an owner's neglect. The old Duke had clearly lost interest in the final years of his life, and Alistair, his son, had inherited a title and a mountain of problems he either did not understand or did not wish to face. Her dowry had been a plaster applied to a festering wound, a temporary reprieve, not a cure. Within 5 years, by her calculations, the estate would be in precisely the same state of insolvency it had been in before their marriage. She worked with a quiet, methodical fury. She drew new maps, marking out fields that were underproducing and noting which tenant farms were most in need of investment. She created new ledgers, her own neat, clear script, a stark contrast to the sloppy, incomplete entries of the official books. The small study, once a tomb of forgotten knowledge, became a vibrant center of analysis. She brought in specimens from the grounds, leaves from blighted oak trees, samples of soil from the waterlogged lower pastures, and used the old books to diagnose the problems. The room itself began to change. Agnes brought her a thick woolen shawl from her own sparse belongings, and a rug that had been destined for the rag pile. Philippa spent a few shillings of her small personal allowance to buy a better lamp and a supply of good candles. The fire was kept burning day and night. The room was still cold, but it was a busy, purposeful cold, the chill of a workshop, not a prison. It smelled of wood smoke, old paper, and the dried herbs she began to collect and press between the pages of a botany text. It became the only place in the whole of Thornwick Park where she felt she was not a ghost. She knew she was taking a risk. Her work was a secret, an appropriation of a role that was not hers. If the Duke were to discover it, he might see it as the ultimate transgression, a merchant's daughter meddling in the affairs of the aristocracy. But the alternative, to sit silently in her cold room while the foundation of her own security crumbled beneath her, was unthinkable. This was not just about saving his estate. It was about securing her own future. It was about the promise she had made to herself. She would not be a victim of circumstance. She would be an agent of it. One afternoon, as she was bent over a map, tracing the line of a silted-up drainage ditch, she heard a sound that was utterly foreign to the North Tower. The firm, authoritative tread of a man's boots on the stone stairs. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Agnes was in the village on an errand. There was no one to announce a visitor. The footsteps stopped outside her door. There was a pause. Then a sharp, peremptory knock. Philippa took a breath, rose from her chair, and smoothed the front of her gown. She walked to the door and opened it. The Duke of Thornfield stood on the landing. He was dressed for riding, his boots splattered with mud, and his handsome face was set in a thunderous expression. For a moment, he simply stared at her, his gaze sweeping over her plain dress and ink-stained fingers. Then his eyes moved past her, into the room, and fixed on the table, covered in her papers, her maps, her open ledgers. His jaw tightened. "What?" he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Is the meaning of this?" Alastair's discovery did not unfold with the explosive anger Philippa had braced herself for. Instead, a frigid, unnerving calm settled over him. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, moved from the papers on her table to the neatly organized shelves, then back to her face. He seemed less outraged than baffled, as if he had stumbled upon a secret and incomprehensible ritual. "This room," he began, his voice low and clipped, "was assigned to you for your residence." "And I reside in it, Your Grace," Philippa replied, her own voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. She did not retreat, but held her ground in the doorway. "This is not residence. This is an occupation." He gestured with a gloved hand towards the study. "What are you doing in there?" She knew this was a pivotal moment. Deception or evasion would be a fatal error. Her only defense was the truth, presented as simply and unassailably as a line in a ledger. "I am reading, Your Grace." "Reading?" He gave a short, incredulous laugh. "It appears to be more than that. Mrs. Finch informs me you have requested copies of the weekly estate reports." So that was it. Her quiet requests for information had finally reached him.
"I have," she confirmed. "I find them incomplete."
His eyebrows drew together. "Incomplete? They are prepared by my estate manager, Mr. Fletcher. He has served this family for 20 years.
"I do not doubt his loyalty," Philippa said carefully, choosing her words as a climber chooses footholds on a treacherous cliff. "Only, perhaps, his attention to detail. For example, the rent collected from the 5 cottages at Amberley has been recorded as 10 shillings per household for the last quarter. Yet the tenant agreements, which I found in the records here, stipulate 12.
Alastair stared at her. For a moment, he seemed to be processing the sheer audacity of her statement. He had expected tears, pleas, perhaps a defiant outburst. He had not expected an audit. "You have been reviewing tenant agreements?" he asked, a note of disbelief coloring his tone.
"Among other things," she said. "The old Duke's sister kept meticulous records. It seems a pity to let them go to waste."
This gave him pause. The mention of his great-aunt, a formidable woman, spoken of in family law as both a brilliant eccentric and a cautionary tale, seemed to shift his perspective. He looked again at the study, not as an unauthorized office, but as a continuation of a forgotten legacy. "What business is it of yours?" he asked, but the question lacked its initial force. It sounded less like an accusation and more like a genuine inquiry. "My father's dowry is now invested in this estate, Your Grace," Philippa said quietly. "Its welfare is, therefore, my business. I am merely protecting my investment." She had used the language of their transaction, the cold, hard vocabulary of commerce. It was a language he understood. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not warmth, not yet, but a grudging respect. He had dismissed her as a merchant's daughter, an ornamental piece of a financial arrangement. He had not considered that a merchant's daughter might inherit a merchant's mind. He did not press the issue further. Without another word, he turned and descended the stairs, his footsteps echoing on the stone. He did not forbid her from her work. He did not demand she cease. And in his silence, Philippa understood, was a form of concession. He had not approved, but he had not prohibited. She had established a foothold. The encounter, however, had ripple effects. The staff, who had undoubtedly heard the Duke's ascent to the Forbidden Tower, now looked at her with a new kind of curiosity. Her exile was no longer seen as a simple punishment, but as something more mysterious. The Duchess in the North Tower was no longer a tragic figure. She was an enigma. The Duke's own behavior began to change in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. He did not speak to her, but she began to feel his observation. Once, looking down from her window, she saw him standing by the ha-ha, looking not towards the grand vista of the park, but up towards her tower. He held the pose for a full minute before turning away. Another time, a book she had requested from the main library, a modern text on agricultural chemistry, appeared outside her door, left by a footman who claimed the Duke had thought she might find it of interest. The most significant change, however, was precipitated by the estate's resident social enforcer, Lady Eugenia Montague, a distant cousin of the Duke's late mother. Lady Eugenia had made it her personal mission to police the boundaries of their class, and she viewed Philippa as a regrettable but necessary contamination. During one of her frequent visits, she found Alastair in the gun room, brooding over a map of the estate. "My dear Alastair," she began, her voice dripping with manufactured concern, "the county is beginning to talk about your arrangement. To have one's wife living in an old tower like some madwoman from a novel. It reflects poorly on the title." Alastair continued to stare at the map. She chose the rooms herself. It was a lie, but a necessary one to preserve his pride. "Of course she did," Lady Eugenia said soothingly. "She is not one of us. She doesn't understand how these things appear. But what I hear is more concerning. They say she is playing at steward, interrogating the tenants, scribbling in little books. It is unseemly. A duchess should concern herself with needlepoint and visiting, not drainage and crop yields. You must put a stop to it. It makes you look weak." Alastair finally looked up, his eyes cold. "And what would you have her do, Eugenia? Redecorate the drawing room? The funds for which came from her father's pocket. Should she plan a ball, so the county can come and stare at her like a prize sow at a fair, all while standing on carpets her dowry paid for?" Lady Eugenia was taken aback by his vehemence. "I only mean to protect the family's dignity." "The family's dignity is best protected by solvency," he snapped, rolling up the map with a sharp gesture. "And if my wife finds amusement in scribbling in little books, then it is a harmless and inexpensive pastime, far less costly than the pastimes of other women I have known." The barb was aimed at a past he never spoke of, but which Eugenia understood perfectly. She retreated, flustered and defeated. But her words, intended to shame him into action against Philippa, had the opposite effect. They defended Philippa, forcing him to articulate a justification for her strange behavior. And in defending her, he was forced to consider her position more deeply. She was not merely playing at steward. She was, as she had claimed, protecting her investment. It was a motive he, a man struggling under the weight of his own inheritance, could not help but understand. That evening, a second book appeared outside Philippa's door. It was a slim volume, bound in dark green leather. An inquiry into the management of the woodlands of Great Britain. There was no note, but Philippa knew it was not a random selection. The day before, she had sent a query to Mr. Fletcher about the low price he had accepted for the sale of oak from the West Woods. The book was a response. It was a conversation, conducted at a distance of 2 corridors and a world of pride. But it was a conversation nonetheless. The ice was beginning to crack. Philippa's quiet influence began to extend beyond the walls of the North Tower. Armed with her growing knowledge, she started to take small, calculated actions. She began to walk the estate, not as a duchess taking the air, but as an inspector. Dressed in a plain cloak and sturdy boots, with Agnes as her companion, she would visit the tenant farms. She did not announce herself as the Duchess, To most of the tenants, who had only seen her at a distance in church, she was simply a quiet, well-spoken woman from the great house who asked intelligent questions. She spoke to farmers about the rot in their potato fields and listened to their wives' worries about the damp in their cottages. She took notes not in her grand ledger, but in a small, discreet notebook she kept in her pocket. Her first direct intervention was at the farm of a man named Seth, a tenant whose family had worked the same plot of land for 100 years. His fences were in a state of collapse, and his small herd of cattle was perpetually wandering. He had petitioned Mr. Fletcher for wood to repair them for over a year, to no avail. Philippa inspected the fences herself, her gloved hands testing the rotten posts. She then walked the perimeter of the nearby copse, a section of woodland designated by the estate as non-commercial. It was overgrown with silver birch, a fast-growing, relatively low-value wood, but perfectly adequate for fence posts. That afternoon, she sent a note not to Fletcher, but directly to the head woodsman. It was written on plain paper and signed simply, P. Sinclair. Mr. Evans, it read, please have your men thin the silver birch from the west copse as discussed. Deliver 1 cartload of posts to Seth at Low Meadow Farm. The remainder can be seasoned for kindling for the main house. The current supply from the village is both overpriced and of poor quality. It was a gamble. She was overstepping her bounds, usurping the authority of the estate manager. She waited for the summons from her husband, the angry confrontation. It never came. 2 days later, on her walk, she saw Seth and his son setting new, pale birch posts along the edge of their pasture. The farmer saw her approaching and touched his hat, a look of stunned gratitude on his weathered face. He did not say a word, but his expression was thanks enough. The woodsman, Mr. Evans, had likely shown the note to the Duke. The Duke had clearly chosen to do nothing. His inaction was a form of permission. This small success emboldened her. She discovered that the estate was paying a premium for lime to treat the acidic soil of the upper fields. Her research in the old books and maps revealed that a chalk pit on the far edge of the estate, unused for 50 years, was still viable. A single note to the quarrymaster was all it took to restart the small-scale extraction, saving the estate a considerable sum. Each action was a pebble dropped into the still pond of Thornwick's mismanagement. The ripples began to spread. The tenants started to speak of the grey lady who walked the fields and seemed to understand their troubles. The staff at the great house, from the grooms in the stable to the scullery maids, whispered about the changes. Leaky roofs were being patched. A reliable source of firewood appeared. The quality of the ale in the servants' hall improved, as Philippa had pointed out to the butler that the supplier was delivering inferior product. These were not grand, sweeping reforms, but small, practical adjustments that made a tangible difference in the daily life of the estate. They created a current of goodwill that flowed, quietly but insistently, towards the North Tower. Alistair could not fail to notice. The atmosphere of the house was changing. The low-level anxiety that had hummed beneath the surface for years was beginning to dissipate. There were fewer complaints, fewer crises. His estate manager, Mr. Fletcher, grew sullen and defensive, frequently complaining about interference and unorthodox channels. But his complaints were vague, as he could not directly accuse the Duchess without revealing his own incompetence. One evening, Alistair found himself in the main library, a vast, cold room he rarely used. He was searching for a book on estate law, a desperate attempt to find a solution to a looming mortgage payment he had no way of meeting. As he ran his hand along the shelves, his fingers brushed against a volume that seemed out of place. It was a book of poetry, one his mother had loved. Tucked inside was a pressed flower, a small, perfect specimen of wild orchid. He knew, with an instinct he could not explain, that it was Philippa's. He had seen her walking in the water meadows where the orchids grew. The thought of her, his cold, quiet, transactional wife, pressing flowers in a book of poetry, was so at odds with the image he had of her, the ink-stained, ledger-keeping creature of the North Tower, that it disoriented him. He was beginning to realize that he did not know this woman at all. He had created a caricature of her in his mind, the ambitious merchant's daughter, and he had treated her accordingly. But the woman who audited his accounts, repaired his tenants' fences, and pressed flowers in books of poetry was someone else entirely. She was a stranger, living under his own roof. The tension between them shifted. It was no longer a simple matter of coldness and resentment. It became a more complex, charged awareness. They were two poles of the same failing institution, circling each other in silence. He was the titled, powerless master. She was the untitled, powerful servant. And the space between them crackled with unspoken questions. He began to seek out opportunities to observe her. He would alter his riding path to pass a field where he knew she would be. He saw her once, kneeling in the dirt, speaking with a farmer's wife about a sick child, her expression one of intense, compassionate focus. There was no artifice in it, no performance. He was the Duke, but she was the one who was earning the loyalty of his people. The thought was both infuriating and, to his astonishment, humbling. The foundation of his world was beginning to tilt. The late autumn of that year was unnaturally wet. A persistent, weeping rain fell for 3 weeks, turning the fields of Thornwick into a sodden quagmire, and the sky into a permanent sheet of grey. The river that snaked through the lower pastures swelled its banks, its brown water creeping higher each day. Philippa, watching from her tower window, felt a growing sense of dread. Her study of the old maps had shown a history of flooding in this exact area, a problem the old Duke's great-grandfather had solved by building a series of levees and drainage canals. But her more recent inspections had revealed that those canals were now choked with silt and debris, and the levees were crumbling. She had sent a memorandum to Mr. Fletcher 3 weeks prior, outlining the necessary work and estimating the cost. The memorandum had gone unanswered. She had then sent a copy to the Duke, with a single, urgent line appended. "This work cannot be delayed." He had not responded. The crisis arrived not with a bang, but with a slow, inexorable surge. On a Tuesday night, the river finally broke through the weakest point in the levee. Water poured into the lower pastures, submerging the fields where the winter wheat had just been sown. By dawn, the water had reached the cottages of the 3 tenant farmers who lived on the floodplain. News of the disaster reached the great house at breakfast. A panicked farmhand, soaked to the skin and shivering, brought the report. Alistair, who was standing by the dining room window, staring out at the deluge, received the news with a grim, fatalistic stillness. It was one more failure. One more piece of his inheritance, turning to mud in his hands. "Get the men from the stables," he ordered the footman, his voice strained. "We'll see what can be done to evacuate the families." He turned to leave, his face a mask of controlled despair, and found Philippa standing in the doorway. She was already dressed in her practical cloak and boots, her face pale, but her expression resolute. In her hands, she held a rolled-up map. "Evacuation is necessary," she said, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the panic in the room. "But it is not a plan. We need to divert the flow." He stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. "Divert the river? With what, Duchess? Sheer force of will?" "With geography," she countered, stepping into the room and spreading her map on the vast, polished surface of the dining table. It was one of the old survey maps, but she had updated it with her own annotations in sharp black ink. "Here,
she said, pointing with a steady finger. This is where the levee broke. The water is flowing into the basin of the lower pastures. But here, half a mile upstream, is the old sluice gate for the water meadows. According to the estate plans from 1780, it was designed to redirect overflow in precisely this situation. If we can get it open, it will relieve the pressure and divert the bulk of the water into the western marshland. Alistair looked from the map to her face. The western marshland was useless, boggy ground. The lower pastures were the most fertile land on the estate. The logic was impeccable. The sluice gate hasn't been opened in 50 years. The mechanism will be rusted solid. It's impossible. Difficult, perhaps. Not impossible, she replied. It will require leverage and manpower, but it is our only chance to save the winter crop and prevent the cottages from being washed away entirely. Mr. Fletcher, who had scurried into the room, scoffed. It's a fool's errand, Your Grace. The girl is talking nonsense. We must simply weather the storm. Philippa did not even look at him. Her eyes were fixed on Alistair's. It was her knowledge against his manager's blustering incompetence. Her quiet, researched certainty against his loud, ignorant despair. In that moment, the entire hierarchy of the house inverted. She was the one with the plan. She was the one in command. Alistair looked at the map, at the clear, confident lines she had drawn. He looked at Fletcher's florid, anxious face. And then he looked at his wife, at the quiet strength in her posture, the intelligence shining in her eyes. For months, he had been trying to hold his world together with pride and silence, and it was crumbling around him. She, in her exile, had been building a foundation of knowledge that might actually save it. He made a decision. It was an abdication of his own authority, an admission of his own failure, but it was also the first truly pragmatic choice he had made in years. Fletcher, he said, his voice hard as iron. You will take 5 men and see to the evacuation of the cottages. Now! The manager stared, his mouth agape, but something in the Duke's tone prevented him from arguing. He bowed stiffly and hurried out. Alistair turned back to Philippa. Show me this sluice gate, he said. It was not a request. It was a concession. The scene at the river was one of controlled chaos. A dozen men from the estate, their faces grim, worked under a relentless driving rain. Alistair, stripped of his ducal jacket and waistcoat, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, worked alongside them, his aristocratic bearing forgotten in the face of mud and rising water. He was shouting orders, his voice raw. But it was Philippa's map and Philippa's plan they were following. She stood on a small rise, sheltered slightly by an ancient oak, her cloak pulled tight around her. She was not directing the men. That was Alistair's role. But she was the strategic center of the operation. When a question arose, it was to her that he turned. The sluice gate was exactly as she had predicted. A massive iron wheel, thick with rust, connected to a mechanism submerged in the churning water. It would not budge. The men heaved, their muscles straining, but the wheel was frozen solid. Despair began to set in. "It's no use, Your Grace!" one of the men shouted over the roar of the river. "She's seized for good!" Alistair's shoulders slumped. He had allowed himself a flicker of hope, and now it was being extinguished. He looked over at Philippa, a silent admission of defeat. But she was already moving, picking her way down the muddy bank toward an old, dilapidated shed that stood near the mechanism. She disappeared inside. A moment later, she emerged, carrying 2 things: a can of oil used for wagon axles, and a long, heavy iron bar. She handed them to Alistair. "The oil on the gears," she said, her voice almost lost in the storm. And the bar for leverage. Use the central spoke as a fulcrum. It was simple mechanics, a principle of physics. Alastair stared at her, then at the tools in his hands. He passed the oil can to a workman and wedged the heavy iron bar into the wheel as she had directed. 3 men put their weight on it. There was a terrible, groaning screech of protesting metal. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden, violent crack, the rust-fused gears broke apart. The wheel began to turn, slowly at first, then with gathering speed. A collective shout went up from the men. Below them, a huge wooden gate began to rise from the riverbed, and the torrent of water, finding a new path of least resistance, surged sideways into the channel that led to the marsh. The pressure on the main river lessened almost immediately. The relentless rise of the water in the lower pastures slowed, then stopped. They had done it. They had not saved the ruined wheat, but they had saved the land itself and the homes of the tenants. For a long moment, no one spoke. The men, exhausted and mud-splattered, leaned on their tools, breathing heavily. Alastair stood by the sluice gate, his hand resting on the now turning wheel, watching the water divert. He looked downstream, toward the pastures, then back at the small, cloaked figure of his wife. She had not joined in the celebration. She was simply watching, her face unreadable in the grey light. He walked over to her, his boots sinking into the mud. The rain had plastered a strand of dark hair to her cheek. Her hands, he noticed, were trembling slightly, not from cold, but from the release of tension. He stopped in front of her. He was the Duke of Thornfield. He was the master of this estate, and he had been saved by the woman he had tried to bury in its coldest room. The humiliation of it was a physical blow, but underneath it was something else, something vast and unsettling, a wave of profound, unadulterated awe. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice rough. "How did you know any of this?" Philippa finally met his gaze. Her eyes were dark and tired. "Because I looked," she said simply. "I read the books. I walked the land. I listened to the people. It was all there, waiting to be seen. You simply had to be willing to look in the forgotten places." Her words were not an accusation, but he felt them as such. He had been so consumed by the wound of his title, the burden of his inheritance, that he had become blind to the estate itself. He had been trying to rule it from a distance, through ledgers and managers, while she had been learning it from the ground up. That evening, the storm passed. A fragile, watery moonlight illuminated a landscape transformed. The north tower was silent, the fire in the hearth burning low. Philippa sat at her desk, not working, but staring into the flames. She was exhausted, a deep, bone-weary fatigue that went beyond the physical exertions of the day. She had proven her worth. She had saved a piece of his world. And yet, she felt a profound emptiness. She had won a battle, but she did not know if it had changed the terms of the war. There was a knock on her door. Not the timid tap of Agnes, but the same firm, authoritative knock she had heard weeks before. She rose and opened it. Alastair stood there. He had changed into dry clothes, but he looked as exhausted as she felt. His face was pale, and the usual mask of cold pride was gone, replaced by something raw and uncertain. He held a silver tray. On it was a plate of sandwiches, a small wedge of cheese, and a decanter of wine with 2 glasses. "I thought you might be hungry," he said.
It was the first truly considerate thing he had ever said to her. She stepped back, allowing him to enter. He placed the tray on the small table by the fire, his movements stiff and awkward. He was in her territory now, the room he had chosen as her prison, and he seemed to feel its power. His eyes took in the details he had missed before. The botany text open on a side table, the neat stacks of paper, the row of pressed herbs hanging from a string to dry. This was not a cell. It was a scholar's study. "Thank you," she said quietly, sitting in the single chair by the fire. He poured 2 glasses of wine, his hand not quite steady. He passed one to her and took the other, but he did not sit. He walked to the window and looked out at the moonlit, waterlogged land. "The damage is severe," he said, his back to her. "The winter crop is lost. It will cost a fortune to repair the levee and reclaim the fields." "But the cottages are safe," Philippa said. "And the land will recover. The soil is good." He turned around, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "You sound more certain of that than I am." "Certainty comes from knowledge, Your Grace, not from hope." He flinched at the formal title. "Alistair," he said, his voice rough. "My name is Alistair." He took a long swallow of wine, then set the glass down with a click. "I owe you an apology." Philippa waited, her hands folded in her lap. "Not just for today," he continued, his gaze fixed on the floor. "For everything. From the moment you arrived. I have behaved abominably. I have treated you not as my wife, but as part of an unfortunate transaction." "That is what it was," she said, her voice devoid of accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. "Yes," he admitted. "It was. But it was not your fault. I held you responsible for my own misfortune, for my own pride." He finally looked at her, and she saw in his eyes a deep, aching vulnerability that startled her. "I was engaged once before," he said, the words coming out in a rush, as if he had been holding them in for years. "To Lady Vivian Ashworth. It was considered a brilliant match. 2 weeks before the wedding, my father confessed to me the true state of our finances. He had gambled away a fortune. We were on the brink of ruin. I was honor-bound to tell her. I offered her a chance to withdraw from the engagement." He paused, a muscle working in his jaw. She did not hesitate. Her father had her in a carriage and on the way back to London within the hour. She sent a note. It said she could not, in good conscience, tie her family's name to scandal and poverty. What it meant was that the title was only worth having if it came with the wealth to support it. The story fell into the quiet room, explaining everything. His bitterness, his coldness, his immediate assumption that she, another woman brought to him in a time of financial desperation, was cut from the same cloth. He had been wounded, and he had organized his life around the scar, calling his distrust principle. "When my father died, and the lawyers proposed this arrangement with your family," he went on, "I saw only a repetition. I saw you as another Vivian, a woman purchasing a title. I assumed you would demand the silks and the jewels and the balls, and I would despise you for it. So I decided to despise you from the start. It was easier." He looked around the room, at its stark, functional purpose. "And you did none of those things. You asked for nothing. You simply took the worst this house had to offer, and you made it work. You did the work I should have been doing." He walked over to the desk and picked up her ledger, the one she had started on her first night. He opened it to the first page, to the bleak accounting of her assets and liabilities. he saw the tear-smeared word, cold. A look of profound shame crossed his face. He closed the book gently and placed it back on the desk. "I gave you this room to punish you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "To isolate you. To make you understand that you were not welcome here." He turned to face her, his expression stripped of all its former arrogance. "Instead, you have made it the one place in this entire God-forsaken estate where anything of value is actually being done. You have made it the heart of the house." He did not know what to do next. He had confessed, he had apologized, but the chasm between them remained. Words were not enough to bridge it. Philippa looked at him, at the proud, broken man standing in her sanctuary. She saw the years of bitterness he had carried, the wound he had mistaken for his own character. She felt not triumph, but a deep, aching pity. "What you did was cruel, Alistair," she said softly. "But I understand it." And in that moment of quiet, unadorned forgiveness, something shifted in the room. The cold, which had been a constant presence, seemed to recede, pushed back not by the fire on the hearth, but by a fragile, nascent warmth between them. The foundation of a new contract was being laid, one not of commerce, but of understanding. The morning after the storm and the confession, the atmosphere at Thornwick Park was irrevocably altered. A new order had been quietly established. When Alistair descended for breakfast, he sent a footman not to Mr. Fletcher's office, but to the North Tower with a message. "The Duke requests the Duchess's presence in the estate office at her convenience." The use of the word requests instead of requires was a revolution in itself. Philippa arrived half an hour later, carrying a small stack of her own ledgers. The estate office was a grand, wood-panelled room on the ground floor, dominated by a massive desk and the lingering scent of stale cigar smoke. Mr. Fletcher was already there, standing stiffly by the window, his face a mask of resentment. Alistair stood behind the desk, his expression unreadable. "Good morning, Mr. Fletcher," Philippa said, her tone neutral. The manager gave a curt, dismissive nod in her direction, then addressed the Duke. "Your Grace, I have prepared a preliminary estimate of the flood damage. It is, as I predicted, catastrophic. We will require a mortgage of some magnitude to begin repairs." "Indeed," Alistair said. He gestured to a chair beside the desk. "Duchess, please." Philippa sat, placing her ledgers on the polished wood. Fletcher's eyes widened in outrage at the sight of them, at her presence in this male sanctuary. "My wife," Alistair began, his voice calm and authoritative, "has also been reviewing the estate's position. She believes you have overlooked certain efficiencies." "Efficiencies?" Fletcher sputtered. "Your Grace, with all due respect, the Duchess is an amateur. She does not understand the complexities of managing an estate of this size." "On the contrary," Philippa said, opening her top ledger, "I understand it quite well. For instance, I understand that for the past 3 years you have been selling oak from the West Wood to a timber merchant in Hexham for £10 a load, when the market rate is closer to 15. Curiously, that same merchant is your wife's cousin." Fletcher went pale. "That is a slanderous accusation." "It is an observation," Philippa corrected gently. "I also observe that the contract for feed for the stables, which has increased in price by 20% in 2 years, is with a company in which you are a silent partner, and that the repairs to the east wing roof last spring, for which you paid a small fortune, were never actually completed. I have the roofer's own statement to that effect. He was paid half the invoiced amount and told to keep silent." She presented each fact without emotion, a devastating barrage of quiet, documented truths. Fletcher began to sweat, his face turning a mottled red. Alistair watched him, his expression hardening into glacial contempt. He had suspected Fletcher of incompetence. He had not realized the depth of his corruption.
"It seems, Mr. Fletcher,"
Alistair said, his voice dangerously soft,
"that the Duchess is not the amateur here. You have been robbing this estate blind for years."
Your Grace, these are misunderstandings."
"They are not,"
Alistair said, his voice rising to a whip crack.
"You are dismissed. Have your belongings gathered and be off Thornwick Land by noon. If I ever see your face again, I will have you prosecuted for theft."
Fletcher stared, his jaw working, but he saw no mercy in the Duke's eyes. He turned a look of pure venom on Philippa, who met his gaze without flinching. Then, defeated, he turned and stalked from the room. A long silence descended. Alistair walked to the window, looking out at the drive where, in a few hours, his disgraced manager would depart.
"I should have seen it years ago,"
he said, his back to her.
"I was a fool. A proud, blind fool." "You were grieving your father and overwhelmed by debt," Philippa said. "He took advantage of your distraction. It is what men like him do."
He turned to face her. "From now on," he said, making a sweeping gesture that encompassed the room, the desk, the official ledgers. "This is your domain. I am ceding the management of Thornwick to you. Officially." It was an unprecedented act. He was handing the reins of his ancestral home, the core of his identity, to his wife, a merchant's daughter. He was publicly acknowledging her competence and his own failure. "I will act as your factor, if you will have me," he added, a wry, self-deprecating smile touching his lips for the first time. "I can still lift heavy objects and shout at workmen. You will provide the strategy." A few days later, Lady Eugenia Montague arrived, drawn by the scent of drama. She found Alistair and Philippa in the chilly, magnificent drawing room, a map spread between them on a table.
"Alistair, darling,"
she cried, sweeping in.
"I heard the most dreadful news about the flood, and that you have dismissed poor Mr. Fletcher, after all his years of loyal service."
"Fletcher was a thief," Alistair said calmly, not looking up from the map. "And the flood damage is being managed."
"Managed?"
Eugenia looked at Philippa with disdain.
"Don't tell me you are still allowing her to play with her little account books."
Alistair finally raised his head. He looked at his cousin, then at his wife, who remained silent, her finger tracing a contour line on the map. He reached out and gently covered her hand with his own. It was a small gesture, but in the public space of the drawing room, it was a thunderous declaration. "Eugenia," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the full weight of his ducal authority. "Philippa is not playing. She is the Duchess of Thornfield, and she is the acting steward of this estate. Any decision regarding its land, its tenants, or its finances is hers to make. If you wish to discuss the purchase of a new horse or the price of wool, you will address yourself to her." Lady Eugenia's mouth fell open. She was speechless. She had come to reinforce the old order and had walked directly into the public unveiling of the new one. The look on her face, a mixture of shock, fury, and utter incomprehension, was a masterpiece of thwarted ambition. She mumbled a hasty excuse and, for the first time in years, made a swift departure. That evening, Philippa was in her room in the North Tower. It was no longer a place of exile, but she had not yet moved. It was her space, the source of her power, and she was reluctant to give it up. She heard his footsteps on the stairs and opened the door before he could knock. He was not carrying a tray this time. He was carrying a heavy wooden box, intricately carved. He set it down on her desk. "This was my great-aunt's," he said, "the one who lived in this room. Her name was also Philippa." Philippa stared at him, astonished. "No one told me." It was not a name the family was proud of. She was odd. She preferred mathematics to marriage. But my grandfather said she was the cleverest Sinclair of her generation. He opened the box. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was a set of exquisite drafting tools. Silver compasses, ivory rulers, pens with fine, sharp nibs. "I thought they should belong to you." It was more than a gift. It was an anointing. He was connecting her not just to the estate, but to its history, to the line of forgotten, intelligent women who were her true predecessors. "Thank you," she whispered, touching the cool, smooth surface of an ivory rule. He hesitated, then reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. His hand was warm, strong. "I have one more thing," he said. "I have had the Duchess's suite aired and fires lit. Your things are being moved. I hoped, you might find it more comfortable than this tower." Philippa looked around the room that had been her prison, her sanctuary, and her salvation. It had served its purpose. "And this room?" she asked. "This room," he said, his gaze serious and full, "will henceforth be known as the estate office, if that is agreeable to you." It was the perfect solution. She would move into the heart of the house as its Duchess, but the North Tower would remain the acknowledged centre of its governance, a permanent monument to her quiet revolution. "Yes, Alistair," she said, her voice soft. "That is very agreeable." He did not release her hand. The space between them, once a frozen expanse, was now filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the heat of earned trust, of a partnership forged in crisis and sealed in mutual respect. It was the beginning of a new accounting, one whose assets and liabilities were not of land or money, but of the heart. 2 years later, the North Tower was transformed. The stone walls were still bare, but they were now hung with detailed, up-to-date maps of the Thornwick estate, drawn in Philippa's own neat hand. The rickety desk had been replaced by a magnificent oak partner's desk, one half of which was covered in her ledgers and papers, the other half reserved for Alistair. The room was no longer cold. A new, more efficient stove had been installed, and a thick, handsome rug covered the floorboards. Sunlight, no longer impeded by grimy glass, streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the fine particles of dust that danced in the air. It was a room of work, of purpose, and of quiet, humming prosperity. Thornwick Park was flourishing. The flood-damaged fields had been reclaimed, their soil enriched by the silt the river had left behind. The tenant farms were tidy and productive, their occupants secure in the knowledge that their Duchess was a fair and attentive landlord. The house itself, once groaning under the weight of debt and neglect, was sound. The roof was repaired, the rooms were warm, and the atmosphere was one of serene order. Philippa's dowry had not been a temporary patch, but the seed capital for a complete restoration, managed with a skill that had become legendary in the county. Philippa sat at her side of the desk, reviewing the quarterly accounts. Her dark hair was simply dressed, but the plain wool gowns had been replaced by elegant, well-made dresses of deep blue and forest green. She was no longer the pale, diminished figure who had arrived 2 years prior. She was the Duchess of Thornwick, in truth, as well as name. A woman of authority and quiet confidence, her beauty illuminated from within by her own competence. The door opened and Alistair entered, carrying a small tray with 2 cups of steaming tea. He no longer looked like the haunted, bitter man she had married. The lines of strain around his eyes had softened, replaced by a warmth and humour she had never imagined he possessed. He had found his own purpose, not as the solitary, burdened duke, but as his wife's partner, managing the practical, day-to-day work of the estate under her strategic direction. He had discovered, to his own surprise, that he was good at it.
"The accounts are balanced,"
she said, looking up at him with a small smile.
"We have a surplus for the first time in 20 years.
"I never doubted it for a moment," he replied, setting the tea down. He leaned over her shoulder, his hand resting gently on the back of her chair, and looked at the neat columns of figures. "Thanks to you." His touch was familiar, easy. Theirs was not a marriage of tempestuous passion, but something quieter, deeper, and more resilient. It was built on a foundation of shared work, mutual respect, and a profound, ever-growing affection. The grand, empty rooms of Thornwick Park had been filled not just with warmth and light, but with the quiet hum of their partnership. "Mr. Evans reports that the saplings in the West Wood are thriving," he said, his voice a low murmur near her ear. "He says he's never seen a better planting. He calls it the Duchess's Wood." Philippa felt a swell of quiet satisfaction.
"It is good land. It only needed proper management."
Alistair straightened up and walked around the desk to his own chair. But he did not sit. He leaned against it, watching her. "I have a proposal," he said, his tone shifting from business to something more personal.
"Another one?"
she teased gently.
"I thought we had agreed on the plan for the home farm."
"This is a different kind of proposal," he said. He came back around the desk and took her hand, drawing her to her feet. "The surplus. I would like to use a portion of it to fund the project."
"What project?"
"The East Wing has been closed for a generation. The rooms are sound, but they are empty. I was thinking they would make a very fine nursery." Philippa's breath caught. They had never spoken of children. It had been a subject too fraught with the clinical obligations of their initial arrangement. But now, in the warmth of the North Tower, the question was not one of heirs and duty, but of family and hope. She looked into his eyes, the colour of a summer sky now, not a winter one, and saw the future he was offering. A future they had built together, from the ground up. "I think," she said, her voice soft but sure, "that is the most sensible and prudent use of a surplus I have ever heard." He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that made her heart ache with a quiet, joyful love. He drew her into his arms, his embrace both a comfort and a promise. From the window of the North Tower, the highest point of the estate, they looked out over the green, thriving lands of Thornwick Park. It was a kingdom they had rescued together. He had given her the coldest room, a place of exile and contempt, and from it, with her quiet strength and brilliant mind, she had given him back his home, his honour, and his heart. The ledger of their life together was finally, perfectly, in balance.